about everybody on campus needs help, not just making the transition, but being what we call an expert writer. Now, an expert writer for us is not somebody whose expertise is writing. It's somebody who's writing in a field in which they have expert knowledge. So, for example, anybody who might call me up in a given day on the university, actually these days send me an email, might be in anthropology, they might be in computational neuroscience, they might be a historian, they might be in comparative literature. These are faculty members who call me up and seek my help with their writing. This astounds most of the people of the world. They would say, wait a minute, a distinguished service professor of, well, I don't know, English needs help from the writing guy? Well, here's a part of the problem. Most of the people in this country and around the world think that writing is a basic skill that you're supposed to learn in grammar school, high school, maybe a little. Then if you go into some specialty field like law, you might in your first quarter get a legal writing course. The idea is it's this basic skill. And obviously there are parts of writing that are basic skills. Grammar, punctuation, lots of things in mechanics. But there's nothing basic about expert writing. That is, taking language and using it to deploy extremely complicated, difficult ideas, arguments, procedures, explanations. I gotta tell you, natural languages are not good at that. That's why the mathematicians, the economists, and the scientists make up imaginary new languages. You know, they make up equations and graphs and charts because natural language is bad at doing what experts need it to do. Nonetheless, lots of experts still need to write. They have a double problem. First of all, language, as I've said, natural languages are not good at handling complications. Natural language is developed when people needed to say things like, look out for the bear. Right? That was a really useful thing to say with language. Language is really good at that. Language is really good at telling stories. Man, natural language is terrific at narrative. One of the reasons why some experts think of their writing as narrative, I actually don't think that's right, but they're trying to sort of jam it into this thing language is good at. So problem number one for experts is that they're trying to think about the world using a tool that is language, which isn't very good for them. They have a second problem, which is almost every expert I work with uses writing as a means of thinking. And again, I apologize for those of you who heard me say this morning, but I was taught in high school that the thinking process was separate from the writing process. I was taught to do all of my thinking and then do my writing. And remember, Miss Johnson said to me, you write after you're done thinking. Think first, then you're ready to write. Miss Johnson, this morning, required us in every paper we turned in to turn in the outline we used like this. I confess, I had no problem doing this. First I wrote the paper, and I wrote the outline. The idea that people were wandering around able to have a complete complex essay leap from their forehead like Athena, full born onto a page where now writing is just sort of, oh, okay, that comes next. That was inconceivable to me. But I thought it was the only one. Turns out, most people are like me. Most of the experts I work with, even though they use outlines, even though they use bullets, even use lots of things, are still thinking while they're writing. This stuff is just way too complicated to not use the writing process to help with the thinking process. That's a very good thing, and we work very hard to not interrupt it, because this is crucial that it be done well. But when you're finished with this, what you're going to do is take this thing you wrote, this text, whether it's an essay, a book review, a grant proposal, an article, a book, a brief, an email. You're going to take this text and you're going to send it to your readers. And the readers are going to have to about the world, to understand something new about the world, to agree with your argument about the world, or to do something in the world you want them to do. Here's the problem. This is what experts actually do, but this is where they succeed or fail. And it turns out that these things are in competition. Actually, a better way to put it is they interfere with each other. It is very predictable that when experts think about the world, they will use language patterns that are different from the way readers read about it. Writers write, when they're experts, in different patterns than readers read. Here's the amazing thing. Even when the readers are also experts. No one's surprised that some expert in a field trying to write to the general public does it badly. All right? This is completely predictable and actually not very interesting. We help those people sometimes, but what interested us from the beginning, and this field of inquiry was started here at the University of Chicago in the late 70s by Joe Williams, who was my mentor. Joe was fascinated by the fact that experts had trouble writing to each other. He said, this is surprising. You know, we have two people. We have an expert and an expert. You're both experts in the same field. You're an expert in this field, but she's an expert in this field. You share the same vocabulary, you share the same training. Why are you having troubles communicating with her? That was an interesting problem to us, so we started investigating. We found out that experts, when they write, are using patterns that help them to think, and these patterns are different from the way readers read. So what we get is this thing I do with my hands all the time. There's interference. Now, this is an interesting problem, because most of the time you don't want the interference. You want the readers, you want your writing to fit with your reader's reading process. Amazing how often, even sophisticated readers, as long as it fits the process, they'll tell you it's correct. Amazing. Even really sophisticated people. You write something in the way they want to read it, and they'll tell you, oh, that's really logical. Let me tell you, it ain't logical. It's just the way you read. Sometimes you don't want to fit it quite so much. Sometimes you want to control a little interference. You do a lot of work with law firms, for example. Sometimes when you're writing a brief for a court, you want some of the sections to look just like that. So the judge says, oh, man, Roger. And you want some of the sections to kind of look like that. You don't want the judge making the decision based on that part of the situation. You're going to lose. You want it on this part of the situation. So you want to say to the judge, hey, look, Your Honor, you write about this one, it's going to be easy to write your decision. You write over here, and it's going to be really hard. I said to the group this morning, there are ethical issues in how we do. I'm very interested in manipulating readers. But the truth of the matter is, most of the people that I work with, they're not interested in manipulating readers. They just want to lay on top of their reader's reading process so the reader says this is persuasive, this is valuable, great, I agree, you get published, you get cited, you get grants, whatever. I bring this stuff into play because great writers sometimes are doing this, and Lincoln's one of them. He's doing some really amazing things in the Gettysburg Address. But I also want to be clear before we launch on the Gettysburg Address is that the Gettysburg Address is not exactly a model that I use to teach writing. It's not when we sit down with people and say, you need to write like Abraham Lincoln. Nobody writes like Abraham Lincoln. This is a truly great piece of prose. But it does connect to what we do teach because it has some characteristics that it turns out expert writers love to adopt. The difficulty is Lincoln understood the way this pattern was going to interfere with his reader's reading process, or in his case, his listener's listening process, so he knew how to help them get through it. Most of the experts I work with don't know how to do that. They want to write in the way Lincoln did, but they don't know the kind of work they have to do to help the listeners or the readers process that pattern. So, what I want to talk about this morning is exactly these patterns in the Gettysburg Address. I want to start with why it's really a problem. This text, like so many texts, that are troublesome for me, so many great things, has a characteristic which is very easy to describe, which is it's what we call a point-last text. That is, the most important thing that Lincoln has to say to his audience, his point, comes at the end of the text. Now, to be sure, it's a very short text, but nonetheless, the most important thing comes at the end. If you look at, does anybody not have a copy? Everybody's got a copy of it? Great. If you look at your copy of the address, and look at the bottom of it, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom, you get the most important thing Lincoln has to say. And you might remember that this address is given in November 1863. We look back on it, and we see the Battle of Gettysburg as the turning point in the Civil War. Well, like a lot of turning points, they didn't know it was the turning point. In 1863, Lincoln was very worried that the Union was going to lose this war. In fact, 9 months after that, he was convinced they were going to lose the war. The purpose of the Gettysburg Address was to rally people to the cause. This is basically the equivalent of a halftime speech at a sporting event. It's to get people to fight harder. Fight on, fight harder. And he says that in this last sentence. He says, it is rather for us to be here dedicated. He's standing in the cemetery of Gettysburg. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. Wow, right? I mean, that's just, wow. And you notice that wow comes at the end. Now, here's the problem that I have as a writing teacher. Look at a text. Look at a text. A lot of great texts in at least Anglo-American rhetorical tradition have their huge punch at the end. Gettysburg Address. Churchill, of course, was famous. It's at the end of the speech that he says, let us so bear ourselves and brace ourselves to our duty, that if the British Commonwealth and its empire last 1,000 years, still men will say, this was their finest hour. Wow. You know? I mean, you want to just end. Boom. You did.
I'm sorry.
No problem. It's better wasn't wrong. It was, of course, at the end of the speech, that Dr. King says, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Everybody I work with wants to save the ending for the big news, the big language, the big point. Well, it also, it turns out, works really well with this process. That is, if you are thinking about the world and you write, it turns out to be a really good process to put here's your starting point. Actually, let me do it this way. Here's your starting when you think. Here's your ending. It's really cool to be able to think your point last. Now, it's not like thinking actually looks like that. Thinking doesn't look like this. Thinking looks like this. But nonetheless, it's really neat that the last thing you write is your point. This is a particularly good way to write. If it's 4 o'clock in the morning and the paper is due in 4 hours, and when you started writing, you had no idea what your point was going to be. Oh, come on, you never wrote like that. You never sat down with an assignment the night before it was due and said, okay, Achilles' anger in the Iliad. Discuss. First sentence. Throughout history, lots of people have been angry. That's what we call the martini glass essay. Lots of people are taught you open with a generalization, you move to a specific pieces, you talk about that, and then at the end you expand out. Looks like a martini glass, right? It's a great way to write, especially if you don't actually put the pieces here, you put it down here, because you get to write all this stuff without any idea of what your point is actually going to be. Right? Writers love this, but experts particularly love it because what they say to us is, "Ooh, my point is very complicated. I think very complicated thoughts." And in other words, they do think of it. So they say, I have to go step by step, step by step. I say to them, no problem, as long as you're as good. Because I got to tell you, nothing is a more obvious interference with the reader's reading process than when you say, I want to go step by step by step by step by step by step by step, and the reader's saying, I have no idea what you're talking about, I have no idea what you're talking about, I have no idea what you're talking about, and by the way, I'm not reading another sentence. This is probably the single biggest interference issue. The expert writer understands the connections between every step along the way. The readers don't. I use this as a simple explanation. Here's what has to happen when your readers read. Take this sequence of numbers. This is a sequence. Imagine it was going to end with the last one, in which everybody in the room, this sequence makes sense, and we know it does because they can predict the next number. What happens in the sequence of information is that the readers have to identify the coherent structure, what it is that makes it coherent while they're reading. They can't wait to the end and then sort of retroactively figure out the coherence process, the coherent structure in the beginning. Let me give you another example. Raise your hand if you find that sequence coherent. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. Don't say anything, just raise your hand if you find it coherent. Everybody else, look around the room. We got about 10, 20% of people who find this coherent. Everybody else thinks, what? Huh? Now, those of you who are coherent, find it coherent, tell me the end of the sequence. 17. These are, of course, the prime numbers, the numbers that work. These are the prime numbers, the numbers that are divisible only by themselves as 1. If you know the structure, quite coherent. If you don't, what? Another one. Two, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. If you understand that one, if you find it coherent, raise your hands. About the same number of people, not necessarily the same people. For those of you who understood it, tell me how it ends. 34. Now, here's what's so fascinating about the difference between these two and this one. In these two, it's almost guaranteed, if you understood the structure, it was because you knew it before you started reading. That's what we call a contextual structure. That is, it existed in the reader's mind before they started reading. This, however, is potentially a textual structure. That is, the text itself creates it. Some people recognize that 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, 5 plus 8 equals 13, 8 plus 13. The text itself establishes the structure as it goes. Both contextual structures and textual structures are hugely important for any kind of expert writing. These are crucial to readers being able to follow. However, here's what happens on a line. Now, raise your hand if you find that one. Coherent 224, 236. If you find that coherent, raise your hand. All right, what's the next number? 4. No. What? My mother's telephone number? You laugh. Right. That's how it's supposed. They write using a coherent structure that is perfectly obvious and powerful to them and utterly obscure to their readers. This is why experts, when they reread their own text, they go through it and they say, oh, yes, exactly, right, wow, terrific, right on. Ooh, it's almost like, I wish I had written that. You did. Because what they're doing is not reading it to remember it. Show an expert a text she wrote years ago and have her read that. You ever done that? You ever pick up a text you wrote 2 years later, you're reading it and saying, what? I wrote this and I don't understand this. Because what's happened was the coherent structures that you had at the time that were part of your thinking process are no longer there. And so now you're having to read it the way the reader does, which is trying to seek for a coherent structure from the context, from the text, that isn't just the process of your own intellectual biography. So, Lincoln's a real problem. King is a problem. Church is a problem. Because what happens is, experts write texts where their thinking process has been like this, and it should be like this. Please don't think I think that experts ought to do some sort of step-by-step. It doesn't. Expert writing is a very complicated business. Their difficulty is, once they do this and they end with their point, they point to things like the Gettysburg Address and say, well, see how good that is? I want to say to them, yeah, okay. Here's what you don't see. You don't see the coherent structures that the text is giving to readers to make the end coherent with the rest of the text. You don't see that. So what I want to do with you in the next 20 minutes is to go through the Gettysburg Address and show you the coherent structures, the things that Lincoln has done in this piece of writing to make sure that when you get to the end, it connects up all the way back with every step along the line, all the way back to the beginning. And the reason I hope you have pens is as we go through this, I'm going to ask you to circle the words that are contributing to the coherent structure so that you're not just imagining them, you're actually seeing how these structures work. All right? So you got your pens out, we're going to go to work.